Hello, everyone. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you are in our little global community, our little global Sangha, digital Dharma meeting room. Please let me know if you can hear me clearly. Oh, hello, Tokyo Shimp. Are you a Three Stooges fan by any chance? Can everyone hear me? Hello, Jeanette. Just checking to make sure we've got audio, video, everything's working. Give me a thumbs up if you can hear me. All clear. Okay, excellent. Nice to see you all here. I'm surprised to see so many people, really, because I've kind of not done this for a long time. The last live stream was due for the first Monday of May, and my mum ended up in hospital, so I had to cancel it. A bit of a shame. So it's nice to be back. And I wanted to continue doing public live streams. At the moment, I'm teaching on Zoom privately the preliminaries for a small group of people, but I don't want to abandon the kind of general discussion, conversation, and the discourse. Oh, I see. Shemp was the most skilled. Okay, amongst the Three Stooges. And I am a hybrid of him with Tokyo Rose. Okay. I'm a non-violent anarchist Buddhist. Very good. Yeah, so as we know, then the conduct of Buddhism is non-violence. And then it's the view of compassion and emptiness in union. And that basically sums up the whole path. So what we've got is the synthesis of non-violence and slapstick comedy in Tokyo Shemp. Good evening, Paul. Yeah, right, it's nighttime over there. Okay. So I haven't seen any questions. Does anybody have any questions before we start? So again, when we begin, first let's just remind ourselves of why we are interested in the spiritual path and what we're looking for. Of course, that will be different for everyone. But basically, there's this underlying kind of wish to improve ourselves in the world and to help make this mundane existence somewhat more tolerable. And then for some, that will also include the notion of transcendence and liberation. And then also for some, it will include the notion of the liberation of all sentient beings throughout limitless space, whether they be our friends or enemies. And so before we start, just remind yourself of why it is exactly that you're interested in this sublime path, and sort of what is your commitment on that path. How will you apply yourself beyond mere aspiration? Okay, so now let's see. Hello, good evening, everyone. Right, so we don't have any questions. Now, let's just address a general question. Oh, wait a second. When I experience a person or an object, how much of my experience is mere imputation? Well, here's the thing. In general, then there's something called the three natures. I've spoken about this before. This is a kind of general Buddhist philosophy. It's more kind of specific to the mind-only school, Chittamatra, but you will hear talk of this also in the teachings on the third turning of the wheel, those associated with Vajrayana. So the three natures, and one of these three natures is what's called the thoroughly imputed nature. So just to recap, we have the thoroughly imputed nature, right? We have the other dependent nature, and we have what is called the ultimate nature. Now this word, yongdrong, in Tibetan actually means a swastika, right? So there's this ancient Indian symbol, and it kind of symbolizes the ultimate truth. So this is yongdrong. And now the ultimate nature is the way things actually abide. What is called the other dependent nature is how these outer objects appear to us. So in general, as you remember, then in Buddhism we classify outer objects as having been made out of particles. So atoms, really. It's not that different from modern particle theory. Things are made out of atoms. And because they're made out of atoms, these external objects, then they can be broken down. So if you either use some sort of laser or razor. You can cut things up, break them up, and they lose their identity. So they have a kind of solid or substantial form, but they break down, which means they have no permanent nature. And that's the idea of other dependence. So especially in the lower schools of the Buddha Dharma, then we see outer objects as being kind of solid things, but they don't have some kind of lasting special nature, that is permanent in any way. It's ephemeral, basically. And then there's this third thing, which is the imputed nature. And the imputed nature is basically just how we label things. It has no real existence of its own, right? It's just ideas about things, like this is good or bad, this is a table. For us, then this might be a table. For someone, they might see it to be a seat. For a termite, it's food, right? We just kind of label on it an identity. The actual outer thing itself has some solid existence, but it's dependent on other factors. So it has no kind of personal identity. We label that identity. So these outer external things and also internal thoughts, they're real in the sense that they rise to our sense perceptions, but they are by nature yongzhong. They are by nature the ultimate nature. In other words, they're empty. They have no fixed identity. And this becomes kind of more profound and more in harmony with the kind of theory on quantum physics. And when we look at that, this actual nature of this solid object like a table is made up of particles that aren't defined. They kind of live in superposition, so they're not fixed in any way. So this is very much in harmony with the Buddha Dharma. So we can imagine that we see a table to be solid. Its solidity is something we perceive if we investigate using our electron microscope, and if we sort of use various modern techniques to come to understand its true nature, what we find is it's ephemeral and it's kind of empty of any fixed identity. So it possesses this ultimate nature, this third one. Now the difference between these two and the imputed nature is the imputed nature isn't anything. It's just something that we have ideas about. It's these concepts that we have. So Steve is asking, when I experience a person or an object, how much of my experience is mere imputation? What is mere imputation is the part where we identify. For example, that is my friend, that is my enemy, that is a table. Functionally, it may be a table to us, but it is not necessarily a table. It can also be firewood, for example. Right? So we can see that very clearly. Of course, then this analysis of how we interpret the three natures changes drastically when you think about the teachings on the kind of third turning of the wheel, or the teachings on signlessness, the Vajrayana teachings. But essentially it's the same. And it's this kind of category of imputation that causes us the greatest problem. And it causes us the greatest problem in terms of our meditation as well. Because what we tend to do is we relate to experience through the filter of how we impute reality. And generally what we do through our life is we build up this kind of lexicon, this database. We've got this, huge hard disk, or this solid state disk filled with all this information that we've accumulated about reality. And we use that information to help us navigate things, right? For example, we need mathematics in order to go to the shop, right? We use it in our everyday life. But for example, if we try to ask ourselves, what is a number? Does a number exist outside of how we conceive of it? Then it's very hard to identify something that is a number or a mathematical function outside of merely the processes in our brain. In fact, if you analyze numbers, then they themselves are ephemeral and empty. As we know, that any number, or we can conceive of a quanta, right? An indivisible particle, etc. But if we think of any number, then that number is infinitely divisible, right? We can infinitely divide any number. So really, ultimately, all numbers are equal to infinity. And so we can see that we need this. We need mathematics to navigate the mundane world, but it itself is nothing solid or real. Of course, there's a lot of debate about this, and you will find many good videos on this topic by very learned people. I'm talking about philosophers and scientists. I think there's a channel called Closer to Truth, and they cover this topic in great detail. It's very interesting. possibly useful for your practice. No, not necessary, though. Let's see, I'm interested in understanding how lamas find the reincarnated lamas that have passed away. Specifically, I'm interested in the 16th Karmapa. Well, as we know, then this Karmapa issue is very tenuous. We probably have people here who follow one Karmapa and some who follow the other. It's kind of nice to see that, well, as far as I understand, that they've kind of met each other and found common ground. So that's really nice, I think. It really is kind of in harmony with the Dharma, right? That we shouldn't be fighting over things. Of course, then there's extreme partisanship and secular and sort of sectarianism in Tibetan Buddhism, and it's a very negative aspect of Tibetan Buddhism. It doesn't mean that Tibetan Buddhism is mistaken. It's just a cultural thing mainly. It's probably got a lot to do with the fact that Tibet was ruled by kings and kind of local warlords and village strongmen, basically. And so they still retain this kind of mentality very strongly. But it doesn't say anything negative about the Tibetan people or Tibetan Buddhism. So this process is interesting. I haven't, for example, personally been present in one of these investigations, but I do have my neighbor, a friend of mine, he's called Trugu Damsho, and him and Khenpo Sher Punso were present during several of the Karmapa's investigations, or searching for reincarnated lamas. In general, then they use, we could say, meditation. So the Karmapa will kind of look into his mind, and then he will gain some kind of information and write it down. I suppose it's a bit like a trance state. So Trugu Damsho, a friend of mine, a very decent and honest and straightforward individual, he's a Trugu himself, but he doesn't accept that. He's very humble. He says, well, I'm just an ordinary person, but my teacher realized me as a Tuku, so I guess I just have to fulfill my responsibility. So he's kind of really down to earth. He's not the sort of person who gives in to hyperbole and spiritual exaggeration. But he was present with my other friend, Khenpo Sher Punso, because he was the Umzi at the time, doing this ceremony to find a reincarnation. And so what he witnessed was that the Karmapa wrote down all this information, details, names, and all that. And so firsthand, he can see that all that information, when it was written down, and then when they found this individual, how it exactly matched, who their parents were, where they were from, and all that sort of thing. There are different ways, but this is one way. It's kind of going into a meditative state and then looking for signs and symbols in the mind that arise to the mind of a significant individual. For example, the Dalai Lama, did this kind of process to recognize the Karmapa and things. What is interesting is how accurate these predictions are. So in our own tradition, then, we often will write down, so the teacher will write down where he's going to be reborn. He himself, or she herself, will have a kind of vision, and then they'll write down all this information, who their parents were. For example, the father's name is Dorje, the mother's name is Lamo, etc. And then from their house, if you look to the east, there will be a mountain, and it looks like the shape of a goat's head or a yak horn, that sort of thing, right? So it's actually really specific information. But they don't just go on this information. Once they open up a prediction letter, or once they look into one of these visions, for example, when the Dalai Lama was discovered, there was a vision that was seen in this lake. It's a special lake in Tibet where they often go to find reincarnations. And there will be various symbols. For example, the mountain looks like the letter A, etc., things like that. Well, once they do that, then they'll go and send out a search party. And the search party will go out disguised. So they'll pretend to be merchants or pilgrims going to Lhasa, and they'll come to the village, and they'll sort of ask around, or they'll send somebody ahead who will do a bit of spying, and they'll find out if there's anybody in this area where they think they might find the reincarnation who matches the prediction. And if they do, then they'll come later as a group, pretending to be, etc., merchants and stuff like that, dressed up like lay people. And then they'll kind of stay overnight. And then they'll say, oh, look, that child there, he's quite special. He's quite precocious. I don't know why. It's really funny. The computer keeps doing things that I have to watch out if I do that. It'll send up a thumbs up sign or balloons or something. Sorry, I'm getting distracted. So they'll go in and they'll look around. they see a child who seems to be really smart or has special qualities, and they think, oh, that must be them. And if they're really certain, then what they'll do is they'll send a proper search party, like dressed up as lamas, and with them, then they will bring the possessions of the previous incarnate lama in a box. And with that, there'll be three drums. One is, let's say, the Dalai Lama's. Two are just randomly from somewhere else or the same era. Bells, all kinds of stuff. And they'll come in and they'll announce themselves and they'll say, well, we think that your child is this incarnate lama. We're going to arrange something in the front room, bring the child in, and we're going to do a test. And they do this kind of test, and generally it seems to be incredibly accurate. Now, there's been some very good research by the University of Virginia on reincarnation. It's actually about personality. The actual study is on personality. It's not about reincarnation. But in it, then they posit that the reason why people have certain traits or qualities when they're born is because they had previous lives. And they make this correlation between previous life and present life. And they looked into this phenomena about testing children using these methods. And so there's this kind of strain of doing this in India. And it tends to be like newspapers, sensational newspapers. They spread stories about reincarnations, and they bring all these possessions. But all of those possessions are the possessions of the child. So it's like they can't go wrong. Whatever they choose, the child will just like, oh, that looks good, I'll have that. But what we find in the way that the Tibetans test it for reincarnation, it's very, very astringent. And they will have all kinds of traps to trick the child, etc. Things that look identical, but one belonged to the previous incarnation, one didn't. And there's a very high level of success. So if that child picks out all the right things, then they think, well, this must be it. And there tends to be reaffirmation later. For example, this happened with the Karmapa. As you know, Akon Rinpoche was instrumental in finding the Karmapa and arranged the search party to go get him. But he was heading to Tibet, and he was stopped. He wasn't allowed to go. An official, someone from the Chinese government, had sent somebody to stop him, not allow him to cross the border so he couldn't do it. So he wasn't able to participate, and he sent his friend. But so later, then he met the Karmapa. Now, before the Karmapa died, Akon Rinpoche, this is 16th Karmapa, had approached him and said, look, before you die, can you please give me a relic? Can you please give me one of your teeth? And the Karmapa said that he would give him one of his teeth. But the Karmapa died and he never got it. So Akon Rinpoche just came up to the child and said, don't you have something for me? And the Karmapa had pulled something out from under his seat. He'd hidden something under his cushion, and it was a baby tooth that had just fallen out, and he gave it to Akon Rinpoche. So these are kind of, for people who believe in this sort of thing, then it gives them faith. And many people are skeptical, right? And it's good. You should be skeptical. You should really look into things, find out for yourself. To give you an example of a modern Western individual who is a skeptic, then the person who instigated this research into personality in the University of Virginia was a Buddhist. And I think he was a student of Ling Rinpoche, I believe. Anyway, he was a Gelugpa teacher. And he was always like, well, there's no empirical evidence for reincarnation. I'm a scientist. I can't accept this, but I have great faith in the Buddha Dharma. And that was his kind of position, which is what many of us have, right? And that's perfectly fine. You should go from the position first of having doubts and skepticism and then look into it for yourself. Don't fall into this trap of just following along with the crowd. It's like, I'm a Buddhist now. I have to see my teacher as Buddha, and just pretend that I have this kind of pure vision when we don't. It's damaging to the Buddha Dharma. It's damaging to yourself. So be skeptical. So there was this scientist, really pure scientist. He was a skeptic, but he was still a Buddhist. He believed, basically, like many of us, well, the Buddha taught kind of good psychological methods to improve life and become a happy person, etc., etc. But reincarnation is not something I can accept. And then he traveled to India because his teacher had died, and then they'd found the reincarnation. And so he went, he went as part of his kind of commitment to his teacher to go and, I suppose, offer a kata. And then when he came into the presence of this child, he was just overwhelmed with this recognition. My God, this child is my teacher. I recognize them, their character, the way they act, and this kind of, the way the child recognized him, and it was obvious to him. And so because of that, then he was inspired to go on this journey and try to make some kind of scientific statements or discoveries about it. And they achieved what's called near conclusive evidence, which is actually really difficult to prove. Conclusive evidence is extremely difficult, but near conclusive evidence. There's different scales in science. I mean, Mary will know about this. There's different levels of proof, and they were able to achieve the proof just before conclusive evidence. So that's amazing, really, that doing pure science and achieving that is almost impossible. So that's just a little bit about finding reincarnate Lenas. And the other thing is, like I say, I've never been present in any of these things, but my friends have actually been there. They were doing the drums and things and helping out with the ceremony for the Karmapa, and he was blown away. And it's also for his own prediction. Like he says, Toko Damsha says, I'm not a Toko, I'm just an ordinary being, right? But he said, like, you know, the Galwa, you know, it means king, but it's when we say our great teacher sort of thing, made this prediction, then it was so accurate, and everything in it was totally precise. So whatever he says, then I'll go along with it, sort of thing. I mean, that's generally a good sign, because the Tibetan Lamas are very humble about it. I mean, some are really proud. That's because they're ordinary beings. But in general, people like Trungpa Damsho, they're very humble. They don't see themselves to be special. Even Taisitu Rinpoche says, well, I can't possibly be the reincarnation of this amazing, you know, Sechi Nimpa or whatever, you know, previous Taisitus, but I'll be their servant, you know. I've been chosen as reincarnation, and I'll do everything I can to support or serve their lineage. How do we meditate on four thoughts? Okay, so, yeah, you do sit there. Do you sit there? Yeah. Think about it? Yeah. Getting distracted, it's not so much of a problem. Meditating on the four thoughts, which is what we're going to do on the preliminaries, is the kind of beginning of the Ngondro, and it involves contemplation. And the thing you should do is look at Words of My Perfect Teacher by Patra Rinpoche. And by looking at that, what you get is a kind of real feeling of what it means to contemplate on the suffering of samsara. He gives all these really natural kind of down-to-earth examples, right? For example, in Tibet, then they slaughter animals, and they do so by suffocating them. Now, I think this is partially because of this idea that they shouldn't draw their blood, right? So they suffocate them. But I mean, suffocation is a horrible way to die, right? So he explains all these things in great detail. Of course, the analogies and the examples are relevant to nomadic culture of the 1800s, late 1800s. So it's a bit difficult for us. But anybody who's been brought up on a farm, for example, right, and you will know you have to slaughter chickens and goose and the sheep and stuff like that, so you'll be kind of familiar with this. And so what we do in the preliminaries is we think of all the suffering in the realms of samsara. We think of how nothing lasts, that everything will crumble and decay, even the mountains and even the sun in the sky. So you really apply real examples of how these kind of four thoughts, these four fundamental truths, are something significant and real, and that you what you do is you develop confidence in that, and that's kind of the inception for your practice. For example, the first one is the precious human existence. So you have to come to the understanding that how fortunate we are to have been born human, and being born human, we have the opportunity to practice the Dharma that other creatures and beings don't have. For example, animals in the sea, you know, they're just eating one another and always fighting for survival. So they just have no opportunity. Not only that, they don't have the intelligence. So there's this kind of thing. It's mostly about contemplation. Remember, there's study, contemplation, and meditation. So especially for the four thoughts, then what we do is we look at the text, we study the text, and then we gain certainty about what's being said. For example, Patra Rinpoche gives us an example of how animals suffer, and then we mull it over in our mind until we develop certainty. So with the four thoughts, we don't really kind of meditate on them. It's more of a contemplation. Meditation comes later. Okay, I think that covers that fairly comprehensively. Yeah, so you heartedly feel it. Yeah, you have to kind of feel it from the pit of your soul, you know. So they say from your heart bone in Tibetan, or from the depths of your heart bone, you have to feel it. And really what should happen is When you're meditating on the suffering of samsara, then one should actually feel this great kind of compassion. So one should actually feel like crying, really, when you think of suffering beings. So there's a wonderful story that my teacher, Khenpo Labo, taught about his teacher, this kind of Khenpo Sherpa or Drupon Sherpa. So he was a guy who basically spent all his life in retreat. He was older, so he was around when the Chinese invaded, and he didn't want to give up his Dharma practice, right? It wasn't allowed. The Chinese didn't allow religion. The monasteries were destroyed and closed, and you couldn't wear robes of a monk or the signs of a Dharma practitioner. But he wanted to keep practicing. So what he did was he found a little rundown stone house somewhere, and he lived in there, and he pretended to be a madman. So he covered poo and pee all over the place. It was like full of shit. And so the party members or the soldiers would come in and have a look, and they'd look and they, ooh, this crazy madman in there, and they'd just leave him alone, and he would practice. I think he actually spent some time in prison as well, and he practiced in prison. So anyway, he was in retreat all his life, like 40 years, and he only had one book. And that one book was Words of My Perfect Teacher. And so what he would do is he would practice and meditate, and then from time to time he'd read his book, and it was all filthy black because he'd been through the pages so many times. And when he was reading it, then he would be sitting there with tears running down his face and like saliva coming out of his mouth because he had such genuine feelings of love and compassion for the suffering sentient beings. And this is the way that you need to contemplate on the four thoughts. Well, sadly, what we do is we do the preliminaries, right? So we've got to do 100,000 of stuff. And so sadly what we do is we look at these thoughts, oh yeah, okay, I understand that, and then we go on, I gotta do my prostrations, gotta get the numbers out of the way. And so that's not the way to do it. That's just doing it like counting stuff, right? What we need to do is change your mind. These kind of common preliminaries are all about developing renunciation and this wish to be free from samsara, and also to free all other sentient beings from samsara. And once we have got this strong kind of inception or impetus for our practice, then we start doing the prostrations. And the prostrations are refuge and bodhicitta. So refuge is, yeah, the mundane world sucks. I need to get out of this. I need a protector. And that protector is the Buddha, or the Buddha, Dharma, and Sangha, the three jewels. And also, we're not doing it for ourselves. We're doing it for all sentient beings. And so that's how we start the preliminaries. And so really the preliminaries of the preliminaries are the most important point. And sadly what happens is we don't take them seriously. We don't invest enough time in them. And so our practice doesn't go well. Because then we're just doing it because we want to get it over with. Or because, some people are competitive. Or we feel like, well, I've got to do 100,000 prostrations. I better get on with it. It's just about mechanically going through the process, right? Okay. Where's the last question? Next question. The search for reincarnation sounds awfully like the three wise men and Jesus. Yes, it's very, very similar in many ways. But again, many people believe that, Jesus spent 30 years in the East. And I've been reading some kind of history about what is called Greco-Buddhism. And there seems to be a kind of avenue for this, the truth of this, that Jesus did study Eastern mysticism and Buddhism, for example, because there was this system of communication, spiritual communication between Mediterranean and the sort of, Gandhara, this area of Persia, northwestern India, Afghanistan, where that was the seat of the Mahayana Buddhism at the time. So it's quite likely. And it's quite likely that these wise men were a search party. Good point, Paul. I mean, I believe that. But many people, when you say that, they just say, that's just a modern invention, It's just a load of nonsense. Because we had this feeling, certainly when I was being taught history when I was young, we had a feeling like there was kind of an iron wall between the Mediterranean and India, and they had no communication. But we can see from, for example, this, what did you call it? The trade systems that happened between these different nations, we could say, that there was a communication, and there was we find artifacts, for example. One interesting point I heard recently was that there was this edict by Ashoka. So Ashoka was the king who kind of established Buddhism in India, also Sri Lanka. And he made this edict that they would try to promote Buddhism or convert people to Buddhism. Maybe not convert them, but spread the word. And so they found evidence that this actually happened in Hellenistic Greece, even. Like they found evidence of this people having converted because of this royal edict of Ashoka in the Mediterranean, in Athens. So that indicates that there was this cross-communication and sharing of knowledge. So my firm belief is that the wise men coming from the East were a search party, of course. Hi, Christopher. Hi, Christopher. Within 5 days. Yeah. Within the 5 factors of mind, faith is balanced by wisdom, wisdom as on-hand experience. Yes, on-hand experience. Now, there's a kind of caveat here, because it depends on how we relate to experience. And also, as it's taught, then appearances are not that important. We have an issue in that we separate appearance and emptiness. So we separate appearance from its nature. And so for many practitioners, what they do is they identify an experience in their meditation, like the experience of bliss or non-thought, and they see that to be wisdom itself, and that's mistaken. So it depends on how we relate to it. If we cling to experience, it is not wisdom. This non-clinging is what we call wisdom. Non-identification, right? When we have the third turning the wheel of Dharma, the teachings on signlessness, then it's all about this not having mistaken identification. That's a deep topic, though. So, Ian Stevenson wrote interesting books on the subject of reincarnation. Oh, thank you for that. Very kind of you to share that, Sonia. Tashi Delik from India. Oh, hello from India. Nice to see you. The science experiment on consciousness and weight turned out to be fake. Oh, really? Okay. I'm not sure what that is. Consciousness and weight. Oh, is that where they saw consciousness to have a certain mass? And so when somebody dies, then the mass decreases by a very slight amount. I think that might be what you're talking about. Well, as far as we're concerned, then consciousness won't have a mass. Because in the Buddha Dharma, it's taught that material objects are made out of matter, which are atoms. They're quantum atoms, right? So they're indivisible atoms. They're more like quantum particles. And that consciousness or mind is made out of discrete time moments. So quantum time moments. And so consciousness is not something that would bear weight, because weight is associated with mass. So that would agree with the Buddhist position. Fake news. Recommended documentary called Unmistaken Child. Oh yes, okay. So there's some recommendations for anybody who wants to do more research. I mean, there's loads online. Sammy Ling even was involved in a documentary many, many years ago. It was interesting, though, because this was in Scotland, in a very kind of, typically Presbyterian, right-wing Christian area where they had no notion of reincarnation. And this young boy had suddenly popped up and was claiming to be from a particular small fishing village somewhere. And so they got involved quite early on because they thought, oh, this looks like reincarnation. But the local press hadn't really gotten into it because it wasn't really a topic in those days. And Ken Holmes, who you might have seen some of his teachings online, he was involved in the investigation. And they went to this place, and the kid had described the view from it. This is the way Ken told me anyway. The kid had been talking about his view from his bedroom window where he used to live in this fishing village. And they went looking, and they found the actual place. And he was just astounded because when he looked out, the kid's description was so precise of everything, where they were placed. Here's a wharf, here's this flagpole, etc., from his bedroom window. And it was just spot on. And so for him, that gave him great faith in reincarnation. Because his logic was, this is what he said to me, well, if it's possible in one situation, then why wouldn't it be possible in multiple situations? And that's so true, right? And it's the same thing when you see these reincarnation discoveries in Tibetan Buddhism. They're just so accurate. Now, here's the problem. We have this tendency to make these exaggerated statements. And I've made a video about this recently. And so people within monasteries will also do this because they're associated with a particular lineage. And so they want to validate that lineage. And so there is this tendency to give in to kind of lies, really. And I don't even think they're aware of it. It's just so, they're just so kind of they want the story to be so true, and they've got so much invested interest in the kind of notoriety, the fame, and etc. of the Lama, the status of the Lama, that they're kind of compelled to exaggerate. And this is a really difficult thing. And this is why I mentioned this research by the University of Virginia, because of course there's none of that there. They're being very scientific about it. And if you look into it, I think there's a documentary. Maybe I'll try to find the link. And there's a book that was written about it. If you look into it, then what they've done is they've collected, or they bought all the artifacts associated with the reincarnation story, and they've compiled all the evidence, and it's really compelling. For example, there was one child, his father was a thresher. He cut wheat and stuff like that and made hay bales, I suppose. And he had a threshing machine for cutting this machine for cutting the stalks of the wheat. And the child was helping him, and his fingers got chopped off. And so it was a really horrible kind of situation for the family, because his only son was then crippled, etc. And so this child died. And the reincarnation, when they found reincarnation had the exact same physical outward manifestation of the young child who had lost his fingers in the exact same way. And so this child was from a remote village, had no connection with this other village, and had all these memories. And he eventually met his original parents. And because of their culture, then the parents said, of course this is my child. They identified, recognized the child, and he would still come and visit them, in his new incarnation. But the associated kind of evidence with these cases is very compelling. So it's worth looking into. Oh, there's a whole channel out there about that. Yeah, I imagine there's loads of it. A lot of it's garbage, Yeah, the kid's remembering stuff, and it happens at a particular age. It's between like 3 and 5 years old. We have a child in our retreat center who came when he still remembered his previous reincarnation. He was recognized by the Dalai Lama as well as being an incarnate tulku. And when he first came, he had this very strong identity of who he was in his previous life, but that fades over time. So you have to kind of catch them at that age. And that's why they don't search for the child immediately when it's a little baby. It's always around 3 years old, that kind of thing. And they're very accurate. So yeah, and like you say, there's a whole channel about this stuff, but there's a lot of basically it makes money, right? People love this kind of thing. And there's all these kind of spooky channels that make all kinds of claims. So you should take everything with a pinch of salt, but also don't be just super skeptical, right? You have to be kind of open to different ideas. It doesn't mean you have to accept something that you don't believe in. Oh, the story you told about the guy frying fish alive really hit hard, yeah. So why was he clicking his fingers? He was cooking them alive, throwing them in his mouth and clicking his fingers. It's because he was liberating. That's how it's taught. Because he was an adept, Mahasiddha. Then so people look at him, and in the Asian tradition, especially in Tibet, then fishing is seen to be the worst thing, because you kind of trick these animals by giving them food, etc., to catch them, right? So it seemed to be really, really nasty. And so a fisherman's a really low class, and in Tibet it's really, really terrible. So then you think, well, on the outside he just looked like a fisherman, like somebody who just kills animals, but then when you read the story, what he was doing was he was liberating them into Buddha realms. And you also hear this in the Tibetan tradition. If you look at the story of Patrul Rinpoche, his own teacher, Do Khyentse Rinpoche, was like a wild man. He drank alcohol, and he went around with a gun, like a musket, shooting it off all the time. And Patrul Rinpoche was a vegetarian, which is really rare in Tibet, right? Because they don't have vegetarian food. It's really difficult. It's like all meat. It's really difficult to get vegetarian food in Tibet. And but there is this tradition, especially in the Kagyu tradition, of being vegetarians, for the sake of animals, because we have bodhicitta. We try to have bodhicitta. So Patrul Rinpoche was a vegetarian, very strict vegetarian. And one day, and he was traveling, and he met Do Khyentse, his teacher, who would just travel around in the wild on hunting parties up in the mountains. And hunters are seen to be really bad in Tibet as well. He was banned in Tibet until recent times. There's an interesting story. The British came, they invaded Tibet, And when they got there, they thought, wow, look at this place. There's all these wild animals. We can go hunting. The Tibetans were like terrified. That's why the Tibetans see Westerners as being like devils, right? So anyway, he went to visit Do Khyentse, who was a hunter, right? So on the outside, really, really bad. But he was a realized being. And so when he was with Do Khyentse, then he was eating meat. And his attendant, the young monk who was with him, was horrified. It's like, I've never seen Rinpoche eat meat. What's happening? He's going crazy. And so Do Khyentse had all the carcasses and they were eating meat on this big barbecue. And then he snapped his fingers or shot his gun or something like that. And all the bones and the skin assembled together and they went running off. So maybe these are kind of just sort of allegorical stories. But the message is that an enlightened being isn't bound by our own mundane world. And they have the ability to liberate people on death, right? So we do POA. And if you can do POA, then when somebody dies, then you can help to project their kind of consciousness into a pure realm. And we think, well, this is not in accordance with the Buddha Dharma, because the Buddha taught that I can't liberate you, you have to liberate yourself. But the moment of death is very significant, as is taught in the Buddha Dharma. And so, for example, the Lama who's doing POA will stand at the head of the body, not at the bottom of the body. Because the way when we die that our wind moves, so what it means is if our attention is drawn upwards to the crown aperture, then it will cause us to have a higher rebirth, right? And so your frame of mind is really important at death. So somebody who's dying, who's in a panic, right, who's fearful, then they become very closed in, right? And people often like poo themselves, right, or pee themselves at death. And this is because the downward wind is forcing. And this kind of fear, anxiety that causes us to release our bowels pushes the wind downwards, and this downward moving wind causes us to be born in unhappy states. So it's really important what happens at the time of death. For example, many relatives argue at the time of death, or they get really sad and they wail, oh no, they've died, this is horrible. And this is really bad for the consciousness of the dead person, because they're still kind of aware for 3 days. It's not definitely 3 days, but they stay in the body, consciousness stays in the body. And this is another thing that has been kind of indicated or almost proven in science. We know this because people have near-death experiences who are flatline, then they still can remember and be aware of what's around them and tell the people there. For example, oh, the doctor was doing this and doing that. So that's quite strong, kind of near conclusive proof that the individual was aware at that time. So they didn't leave their body. Or the consciousness isn't just an emergent quality of the brain. So anyway, although it sounds contradictory to the Buddha Dharma, because of the significance of the time of death, it's very important for all the causes and conditions to be good and harmonious. That means people should have a positive outlook. And when we do this kind of Bardo teaching, right, this Tibetan Book of the Dead, then what you're saying is, look, you're dying now. There's no other way. Right? You don't lie to them. Like in the West, we say, you're fine, you'll be okay. Here, have some morphine. That's not going to work. So what they do is they say, look, you're dying. There's another way. What you have to do is you have to keep a positive mindset. And then, at each stage of the bardo, different appearances will arise. And so what you instruct that individual to do is to, for example, recognize that this intense experience of luminosity is the clear light. And if you go into that, then you'll be liberated. So there is, it is not contradictory, but it sounds kind of contradictory. Interesting thing about the way we die in the West is, and this is going to be a controversial statement, but it's my opinion that the reason why we have so many people addicted to opioids, fentanyl and that sort of thing, is because so many of us now, at the time of death, are high on morphine. In fact, that's what happens in old folks' homes and in the hospital. Oh, they're suffering, the poor thing, let's give them morphine, right? So what you do is, some ads will run shortly for some viewers. Okay, I'll say this quickly. So, we think we're doing them a favor, so we get them high on morphine. And you die, the moment of death, you die with this euphoric and very pleasant sensation. And so, of course, when you're reborn, then you're just going to seek that in your life. And anyway, that's probably a controversial statement, but it's certainly the way I see it. I don't know. I think maybe I'm going to skip the ads. We don't need ads. It's a bit difficult, this ad thing. I noticed that they put them on your videos no matter what anyway. So. Okay, where are we? I got worried when I started crying all the time. Then I realized I was crying because I am feeling the suffering of those around me. That was a bittersweet realization. Yeah, that's really good. Sometimes we think, oh, I'm becoming so emotional. Well, that's actually a good sign. This is what happens to many spiritual practitioners, especially people on the Buddhist path, once they hear the teachings on emptiness, is they become cold-hearted. They become like, well, nothing matters. I mean, this is what I was talking about, spiritual zombies the other day. You get people, they say, you know, you're affected by the suffering of another, and they say, it's all an illusion. That's not an evidence of progress on the path. Evidence that you're progressing on the path is that you will have this heartfelt and real feeling of love and compassion for sentient beings. And at first it will be people you're associated with, but eventually you will be able to have that for people that are your enemies or would be considered your enemies. For example, you know, if you thought, oh, that poor President Trump, he's doing everything to make himself be reborn in hell, and that's quite a good sign. I mean, obviously, some people here might be a Trump supporter. That's fine. We all have different opinions. That's just an example. It would equally apply to Biden if you thought him to be really terrible. But it's a sign. If you start seeing the kind of faults of your enemy as being something that will harm them themselves, and then you give rise to compassion, that's a really good sign on the spiritual path. And this deep emotional feeling is also really, 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 really important. Like I said, my own teacher's teacher, then he would sit there sobbing. Yeah. There was this Geshe previously. He was at the time of Atisha. And people thought he was we would think he was depressed, that he needed to go to the hospital and get some counseling because he was depressed, because he cried all the time. Like Atisha said, well, how are these lamas doing? And one said, wow, he's meditating all the time. Atisha said, oh, that's really good. What about the other guy? Oh, he's building statues and temples. And Atisha said, oh, that's really, 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 really good. And what about this Geshe over here? Oh, he's just crying all the time. And then Atisha went, oh, that is such a good sign, right? It's not what we would do. We think, poor guy, let's cheer him up. Well, it's because he was contemplating the suffering of sentient beings. Okay, that was brilliant. I don't know how brilliant it was, but anyway, I'll try my best. Can you tell us about the prayer wheel? Okay, let's get the prayer wheel. Okay, this is a prayer wheel, or a mani wheel. So it contains prayers, basically. Let's see if we're going to disassemble this. So this is called a mani wheel, but it doesn't have to be a mani wheel. It could have any prayer in it, but in general, then they have Om Mani Padme Hum prayers in them. And so, you know, it's supposed to be like 1,008, right? So the mala has 108, right? So the auspicious numbers. It's supposed to have 1,008. And I always joke and I say this is a Tibetan tradition because the Tibetans are really lazy. And what you do is you do one spin, and it's the equivalent of 1,008 of these. So it's a lot easier, you just spin it. But really, the way I like to put it is that we've got what are called the 3 gates of virtue. I've mentioned this before, right? The body, speech, and mind. These are all 3 gates of virtue. So it's all assembled like this. And inside, then this is a scroll of mani mantras. You can see the edge has been colored with saffron. The paper is yellow because we soak it with saffron. Now, normally what we do is we get all the prayers and then we lay them out and we kind of glue them together, and we use glue made from flour, like barley flour. So it doesn't have any chemicals in it. And then we paint them with saffron, and then we roll it all up, all by hand, put it inside of here, wrap a Om Mani Padme Hum mantra on the outside. I don't know if I can show you. Oh yeah, this one comes apart quite easily. So the previous one I had to return it to the monastery, was one I rolled myself. But you can see this is all, I don't know if the camera will pick it up. It's too blurry, isn't it? Anyway, it's all Om Mani Padme Hum mantras. There's a particular way that you have to roll it. It's all very specific. what's taught in the text. And then you put it inside. Now you could say, well, what's the point of that, right? That's just some kind of superstition. Now the Tibetans themselves are really into something called interdependence. I mean, in general, interdependence is important. So that's why everywhere you go, there's prayer flags, right? Prayer flags have got these prayers written on them, and they sit out in the wind as the wind blows, and all the fibers slowly over time decay. So all the prayers are being spread throughout the world, right? But again, it seems like superstition. And it's often called the Dharma of old men and women. If you go to Kathmandu, and then you'll see all the old men and women doing Kora. Sonia will know about this. Her husband does this. They'll do Kora around the stupa, spin their prayer wheels, and do it every morning and every evening. And it's got to do with this notion that interdependence is really important. Interdependence is really important. I was discussing this with one of my friends, you could say, maybe student. And the question is, how do we come to realize the ultimate nature of reality? Well, part of this process is the accumulation of virtue. We have to have a certain amount of accumulation of virtue. And within that, there's accumulation of merit, there's accumulation of wisdom. But anyway, wisdom's the most important thing. But we need both, right? It says in the text, never overlook the slightest virtue. Right? Avoid all negativity, never overlook the slightest virtue. So it's true, resting in emptiness and meditating for a split second has got greater virtue than saying, hundreds of these, how many pemihongs. But we never know how much we got in the bank. So we could be sort of 99.99999% of our way to realizing the Mahamudra. And so if we're always engaging in virtue, so you're saying mantras, etc., you're giving in generosity, then we never know when we're going to be tipped over that point where our mind is so filled with virtuous thoughts and habits that we come to suddenly have some sort of epiphany. And as I said, there's 3 gates of virtue. There's the gates of body, speech, and mind. And in this process, then we have all 3. Because when I spin it, that's a physical act. I'm engaging my body into what is a virtuous act physically. I know this to be virtuous, or I believe this to be virtuous. And then I say the mantra, Om Mani Padme Hum, Om Mani Padme Hum, Om Mani Padme Hum. That's the virtue of speech. And in my mind, then I've got the notion of this virtue and this bodhicitta, primarily, this intent to become an awakened Buddha for the sake of all sentient beings. And so it covers all our bases, basically. Covers all the bases, and it's a way of preoccupying oneself in virtuous acts only. And so the Tibetans, they have a very strong notion of this. And because of it, then they have got quite a big advantage over us. Because we kind of disregard a lot of this stuff. And most of what we do is we engage in kind of worldly neutral things. We do a lot of negative stuff. It's unavoidable in samsara. But then we engage in a lot of neutral activities. Whereas the old women and men in Tibet, then, whenever they go out, they offer a bit of incense. Of course, it's better if you've studied the Dharma, or if you've, if you are able to really meditate. Most of the old men and women, they don't know how to meditate. But you have to do what you can. And remember also, there's this notion, there's one lifetime after another, after another, after another, going on and on and on and on throughout time. And eventually we have to become Buddha. The lay people don't feel like they're going to become Buddha in this lifetime. But what they hope is, by engaging in virtue, then when this significant moment arrives, what is that? The moment of death, that their mind will be so imbued with the Dharma that they will gain a positive rebirth, and they will be reborn as a spiritual practitioner. They'll have those kind of opportunities. Now, we have these opportunities in the West because we have a lot of wealth compared to some Tibetan villager, right? They find it difficult just getting food for that day. But for us, we've got great luxury. The problem is we don't recognize these leisures that we have, this kind of wealth and resources that we have, were accrued from previous positive karma in previous lives. And so what we do in this life is we squander it. And we don't use it for virtue. And then we just eat up. It's just like the money in the bank. We go to the ATM. We keep withdrawing. We're never putting anything in. Well, they're putting stuff in, which means in the next life, then maybe they'll be born, with the opportunity to dedicate their lives solely to the Dharma and to meet teachers. That's another thing. We make a connection. There's chujel. It means to make a connection with the Dharma. That's why people often go to receive lung, transmission of the texts, so that in the next lifetime there's the causes and conditions for us meeting the Dharma again. That's really important. And that's why it's very important not to give rise to the negative karma of rejecting the Dharma. So remain open-minded. Because if you have this habit to think, this is a lot of bullshit, this is all kind of superstitious nonsense that village people get involved into, and then in the next lifetime, what'll happen, right? You're reborn on the basis of your habits, the way you think, and then you'll be reborn with this thought like, that's all old-fashioned stuff. It's no use to me. And then that path won't be open to you. Okay, time is getting on. Let's see if we can quickly get to another question. Hello, has your path come to fruition? Have you realized true nature? If yes, is it constant? Another question, has your teacher asked you to teach? Oh, okay. My teacher's opinion is, well, this is in general anyway, but it's also my teacher's opinion, is that it's basically one of the jobs of well, let's say a monk, okay, mendicant. So it's kind of our responsibility. That's what they do basically, right? You study, contemplate, and meditate, but also it's a monk's job, as if somebody asked you spiritual advice, that you should tell them. So this is very much my teacher's position. He's very keen on education, and so he's very pleased. I did ask him, but his response was kind of like, yeah, okay, sure, whatever. He's not like, many Tibetans make a really big deal about this, but he's from a different part. He's from Eastern Tibet. So in the West, what we get is sort of like these teachers have this kind of thing like, unless you get this sort of formal permission from your teacher, or if they say you're a realized being, now you must spread the Dharma, right? That you don't get involved. A lot of that is actually to do with this kind of this tendency within the Tibetan tradition to be like kings and monarchs, and so they really keep a tight rein on their students. Actually, Sanji Nimba Rinpoche was talking about this in the teaching I was just listening to. And he said, we can be here, we've got the opportunity to study, we're a monk, we're engaged in virtue, but if you've got this kind of mindset, then it's no use. And that many people in the monasteries, they're very possessive about their students. They don't want other people to teach because they think, oh, you stole my student, etc. Or he went from this monastery to that monastery, I lost him to that lama. It's really strong, this idea. And it's not a bad reflection on Buddhism or Tibetan Buddhism. It's just that these are worldly traits, right? So my teacher isn't like this. He's got this attitude like mendicants should seek the Dharma, study, and you should share what you've learned and that sort of thing. So anyway, so your question is kind of predicated on this notion that you have to have realization, and then your teacher will say, now you may go and spread the Dharma Choga, kind of thing. Well, my teacher is very realistic. He knows that realization is very difficult. Even experience is very difficult. I hope you get a chance, actually, to receive teachings from Khenpo Labu, Drupal Rinpoche, because he teaches things in a very different way. I don't know if Paul has had that opportunity. He's in Scotland. He teaches in a way that seems almost contradictory to what everybody else is saying. So there's this kind of this cultural or traditional aspect of Tibetan Buddhism, which really focuses on this notion of blessing. So people see empowerments to be really important. Like you go to a lama and you pretend you think they're Buddha, and then they sprinkle you with water, and then you'll gain realization by that. That's really mistaken, and my teacher's not into that at all. So anyway, has your path come to fruition? Okay, fruition of this path is what? Fully enlightened Buddhahood. In the Theravadan tradition, the fruition of the path is arahantship. Arahantship is a bit less difficult, a lot less difficult, a lot easier than fully enlightened Buddhahood. So obviously, no. My path has not come to fruition. I am still within samsara. I am still an ordinary being. I get angry. I get greedy. I'm proud. I've got all the negative qualities of a human being. I've just been kind of lucky, or I've had the positive karma to actually be in an authentic Dharma environment, which I have to say is really, really, really rare in the West. Most people don't have that opportunity. And these days, in the East, it's becoming more and more rare because people focus only on the cultural aspect, on the tradition. And because of that, many practitioners are very small-minded and kind of parochial, sectarian. And those are not good qualities in the Buddha path. So have I come to realize fruition? No. Have you realized the true nature? No. Because realization of the true nature means that you are on the path of insight. And of course, people won't know this if they haven't studied. But basically to realize, I've done some videos on this topic, so please look them up. There's one that talks specifically about these things. Understanding, experience, and realization. Realization means that your mind had never kind of anything other than being imbued with the true nature. It remains constantly with your realization. And you necessarily have to be liberated from samsara. And it's not easy. In the West, we tend to think like every Tibetan Lama is realized. And it's just because we're following the tradition. But I've been on both sides of the fence. I've been the Westerner who's new to Tibetan Buddhism, doesn't understand the language, and is trying to find my practice. And then through my fortune or karma, then I've been able to study, become fluent in Tibetan, and kind of experience the life from the side of, the same as the Tibetans, right? My neighbor was Tugudansho. They considered me to be an equal and the same as them because I had a good grasp of the language. And so sometimes they go, "Are you sure you're not Tibetan? Are you sure you're not Nepali?" Because I'm talking just like them. And they think like, in fact, it's a really funny story, is some of them thought I was a Chinese spy at one point. It's absolutely hilarious because Chinese do plant spies in the monasteries. And so they look a little bit Oriental, right? And then, how come he can speak Tibetan so well, sort of thing. So some of them actually thought I was a Chinese spy, which I found absolutely hilarious. But it was kind of a compliment to me, I felt. I think it's because, these Chinese spies are really skillful, right? They infiltrate into the monasteries and do all sorts of things. It's funny, we were worried if the Chinese would tap into our CCTV, because we broadcast stuff from the temple and stuff like that. And I was talking with my Lama about it because we were talking about cybersecurity and that sort of thing. And then we kind of laughed and we thought, well, what are they going to do? The CCP are going to look in and they're going to see us all sitting there praying, meditating. They're like, well, what the hell are they doing? They're just sitting there and they get bored after a while. So anyway, realization is really difficult. The results of the path are really difficult. And if you watch videos on internet, then you get the impression that there's so many people out there who are realized and awakened. This Canadian comedian, he thinks he's awakened. Eckhart Tolle thinks he's awakened. Everybody's claiming realization awakening. I've seen these people claiming that they've realized Kensho. And it's only because they don't understand how difficult that is. And along with that, if you believe what's taught in the Buddha Dharma, then there are various qualities. For example, once you reach the path of insight, which is this path where you realize the true nature, then you have this ability to emanate 100 bodies in 100 universes. So how many of these teachers who are teaching on YouTube can do that? Well, none of them can, because they're just ordinary people. They've just mistaken what realization and awakening is. But I have what is called a reference point. And when I say that to people, they probably think, well, that's not very significant. But actually, I don't like mentioning this, because to somebody who's on the other side of the fence, who knows what we're talking about, then they will see that to be a very proud statement. And we have something called recognizing the true nature. And recognition of the true nature does not necessitate realization or any kind of special ability or power. Ordinary beings are able to do this. I'm not talking about temporary experiences or sudden glimpses or insights of the true nature, which are often of no use to people other than it gives them inspiration. But to understand what this sublime path is about, what this is all about, what the basis of it is, what is meant by true nature. And because of that, when I speak to people who are meditators and practitioners, I can identify very easily where they are in their own practice. And so my hope is that I can use this to help people to progress. And primarily by showing them that there is something else than what they have previously considered to be the results of practice or the path that leads to those results. And to me, it's really something significant. But for most people, they would think, well, that's nothing. My teacher is Buddha, sort of thing like that. But yeah. And I don't want to criticize people, but it's really important. What my teacher says is you should study. You should dedicate yourself to study. And the reason is because without having studied, then there's all these traps you can fall into, these misconceptions about the spiritual path. And so it's very important. And, like I said, I feel like that's a really proud statement, but I'm totally convinced of it. The way my own teacher put it is like, if the Buddha came up to me and said, you don't know how to meditate, then he wouldn't believe that. He would think, well, the Buddha's only saying that for another reason. And I kind of feel the same way. And again, maybe it's just my pride, but I've never seen any indication that's contrary to that. And it's very clear to me. And also the mistakes that other people make in their meditation is very clear to me because of that. And so again, maybe it's just because I'm proud, but I have what is called certainty in that. But what you need to do to gain realization is you need to remain with that certainty. You need to practice. And that is very difficult for me at the moment because I came here from the monastery to look after my parents. And as long as that I've got that commitment, then I won't be able to kind of wholeheartedly dedicate myself to practice. And you need to. And the reason why you need to is because we have such strong negative emotions. And in order to undo those strong negative tendencies, those kleshas, then we have to invest time. And basically it's about eroding this. It doesn't matter, for example, it doesn't matter if you understand that everything is empty. That does you no good, right? Because you're not going to think there's a car rushing at you. You're not going to think, well, that car's empty. I don't need to get out of the way, right? And if you don't get out of the way, it's going to flatten you. You're going to be dead. So it's of no use to you, just understanding or having heard the words. You actually have to transform your mind, and that means to transform the way that you interact or perceive the world. And this has got to do with what we call the Vajrayana view. This is a view of purity. So people have heard of it, the view of purity, having the view, and what they try to do is pretend that they have this view. It's not about understanding a principle, and I have to say that most people don't understand the principles. They just think it's something else. But it's about realizing it. So you study to the point where you have very clear understanding of what's being taught, and through contemplation, then you come to some certainty. When you have that certainty, what happens in your practice is real experiences of the truths arise. For example, the truth of emptiness, or the truth of pure vision. And by an accumulation of those real experiences, then eventually it becomes stable. It never changes. And that's what's called realization. And often people who have reached this stage of realization aren't even aware of it. They need clues and hints. And usually they only notice because they themselves have learned it. For example, if we look at Chantakirti, he was on the first Bodhisattva Bhumi, the path of insight. But he wasn't aware of it at first. But because he had studied, then he sort of thought, wait a second, this is a hint that something's going on. And then he sort of realized that he had some specific kind of supernatural powers, maybe you could call it. Anyway, there's lots of stories I could tell. There's no time here. We're already going over time. Okay. In what you've learned, do you practice physical projecting deities? So I did a 4-year traditional Vajrayana retreat. And that's all you do. 16, 18 hours a day, you do tantric practice. So I've done, 20,000, more than 20,000 hours of this in retreat environment. That means never leaving the front door, never seeing anybody except for the caretaker, and just basically practicing. Even in your sleep, you have to practice this, practice for sleep, etc. Hey, Lama Choga speaking in the hospital, asking my monthly dose of immunity. Ha. Okay, right. So unfortunately, there's more questions, but I don't really want to keep people over time. We're all over the world. It's a Saturday. It's a Monday morning. It's all over the world. People have got things to do. Hello, Mac. Nice to see you. Well, aren't you also appearing in different places? Yes. So the internet has made everybody a bodhisattva on the path of insight because we can appear everywhere. Am I appearing in Alpha Centauri? Am I appearing in a different multiverse, a different iteration of a multiverse? That's really what the Buddha was talking about, that there were infinite other realms, other universes. And you don't have to be reborn in this one. This is an important thing. People often think like, well, what happens when, the planet blows up. Where does everybody go? But you don't have to be reborn. All of these mundane worlds are just kind of fabrications, and anything is possible. There's all kinds of different experiences, different shapes of human being. This is something quite interesting that happens when you meditate, is you start to recognize that this form that we're so familiar with and we're so comfortable with is actually quite strange, right? This idea of this kind of lump of a head sitting on your shoulders. To us, we feel it's totally normal, right? But to other kind of creatures that are based on different symmetry, Mary will know about this. There's these little creatures that are made out of glass, silica glass, etc. And to us, they look like aliens. Well, when you meditate, you get this feeling like you yourself are an alien, because possibly you have some kind of connection with other manifestations. It's very much about what is taught in the Buddha Dharma, and also Steve's question about what is kind of imputation, what is real, what is not real. We are aliens, yes. I think we'll leave it on that note. We are aliens. We are only visitors to this planet, as they say. So anyway, we can't go on any longer. We better leave it at that. And we'll have another live stream on the first Monday of July for people's general questions. But at the end then, what we should do is we should think about why we engaged in this discussion, this conversation. And it is a conversation because I'm reacting to your comments, your statements, and your questions. And on the basis of that, then hopefully we've come to some kind of deeper understanding about the spiritual path. But whatever positive virtue or whatever benefits have been accrued through our engaging in this discussion, and what I suggest is that we give those away. We give away that merit, that positivity for the benefit of all sentient beings suffering through the 6 realms of samsara, so that they can be free from torment and anguish, and also achieve final liberation and freedom from the mundane world. And so leaving it at that, then until next time, I'll see you later.